My daughter's imaginary friend doesn't have a name. He has a job. That's the part I could never explain to anyone, and it's the part that took me 2 years to understand, so I want to say it first and get it out of the way. Every kid I've ever known who had one of these gave him a name. A silly one, usually. My best friend had a rabbit called Butter when we were small. My husband, apparently, had something called the Guy. That's normal. That's a child doing what children do, which is to take a feeling and put a face on it. Nora didn't do that. Nora was 6, and when I asked her what her friend was called, she looked at me like I'd asked her what color the number 4 was, and she said, "He's at work." She was 3 when it started, and I want to be honest about how little I cared. She had a stuffed elephant she talked to. She had a whole society of pine cones in the back garden with a system of government I never fully grasped. So when she started mentioning a man, I filed it with the pine cones. He came up at bath time, mostly. Or in the car. Never at bedtime, which I noticed later and which I've thought about a lot since, because bedtime is when you'd expect a monster. She'd be in the back seat, kicking, and she'd say something like, "He's on shift." And I'd say, "Oh, is he?" And she'd say, "Yeah. He does the 11 to 7. I want you to understand that a 3-year-old does not know what a shift is. A 3-year-old does not know the phrase 11 to 7. I laughed. I actually laughed because it's funny, and I told my husband about it that night, and he laughed too, and for about a year that was the whole story. Our daughter's imaginary friend was a shift worker. It was the kind of thing you tell people at dinner. Except she never stopped. She never got the details wrong either. That's the thing about children and their invented worlds. The rules shift. The Pinecone government had 3 different capital cities in one summer. But the man's job did not change. Not once. Not in 3 years. And I mean that literally. I started keeping track. I have a note on my phone. I started it as a joke. He works nights. 11 at night until 7 in the morning. He works at a shop. Not a shop she'd ever been to, because she described it the way a person describes their workplace, not the way a child describes a place they visited. He talks about the loading bay. He talks about the trolley with the wonky wheel. He talks about how cold the aisle gets and how you're supposed to get gloves, but they never order enough gloves. She told me once, very seriously over her cereal, that he doesn't like the new manager. She was 4. I asked her, that morning, what he did at the shop, and she said he fills the freezers. She said he takes the food out of the boxes and puts it in the freezer so it's ready for the morning. And then she said, and afterwards he waits. And I said, waits for what? And she said, for his lift. Here is where I have to tell you about my mother, because if I don't tell you now, it won't land later, and I need it to land. My mother came to stay that spring. She's a difficult woman in ways that aren't relevant, and she and Nora got on the way. Difficult women often do get on with small children, which is completely and immediately. And one evening I came into the kitchen and my mother was sitting very still at the table, and Nora was on the floor with her pine cones, chatting away about the freezer aisle, and my mother's face was the wrong color. I asked her what was wrong. She said, "Nothing." I said it again. And she said, "You had one." I laughed. I said, "Everyone has one." And she said, "No, you had one with a job." And then she stood up and started washing a mug that was already clean. I asked her about it 3 or 4 times over the years after that, and she never gave me anything more. She'd say she'd misremembered. She'd say she'd had a long day. Once she got properly angry with me about it, which she never does, and she said, "Why would you want to know that?" and left the room. I let it go. That's the thing I keep coming back to. I let it go for 2 more years. The next part happened slowly, so it never felt like it was happening. When Nora was 5, the man got tired. She started mentioning it in passing, the way you'd mention that a colleague looked rough. He's tired. He's been doing it a long time. He wants to stop, but he isn't allowed to stop yet. She said that phrase more than once, "isn't allowed," and I asked her who wasn't allowing him, and she shrugged the way she shrugged at everything and said, That's just the rule. And then, a few months before her 6th birthday, at a garden center of all places, while I was holding a bag of soil, she said the thing that changed my life. She said, "He's not allowed to leave until someone goes with him." And I said, "Goes with him where?" And she said, "Home. He can't go home on his own. That's why he waits in the car park." I put the soil down. I asked her, and I tried to keep my voice completely flat. I asked her whether he'd asked her to go with him. And Nora looked up at me with total, bored contempt, the way 6-year-olds do. And she said, "He's not waiting for me, Mum." And then she asked if we could get the yellow flowers. I didn't sleep that night, or the next one. I want to be very clear that I did not believe any of it. I need you to know that I was a rational woman standing in a garden center. What I believed was that my daughter had picked something up somewhere. The television, a conversation, some man at the school gates. That's what I told my husband, and he agreed. And we went through everything she watched and everyone she talked to, and we found nothing. Because there was nothing to find. And I knew there was nothing to find before we started. So a week later, I asked her which shop. She told me. She described the sign. She described the color of the sign, which is green, and the way you come off the roundabout, and the fact that the car park has 2 entrances, but one of them is always coned off. She described the loading bay at the back, and the bins and the fence behind the bins. She had never been there. It is 40 minutes from our house, in a town we have no reason to visit, and I have never once shopped there in my life. And I want to tell you that I went straight there. I didn't. I sat with it for 11 days. I looked the place up on my phone, in the car, in a supermarket car park, like a woman having an affair. And it was all exactly as she'd said it, right down to the coned entrance. And I closed the phone and I went inside and I bought fish fingers, and I did not tell my husband. I sat there for over an hour in the dark with the engine off and my hands in my lap, and a woman came out with a bag of shopping and a boy on a bike went past, and I started to feel like the stupidest person alive. And I remember thinking, quite clearly, I'm going to go in. On the 12th day, I told him I was going to see a friend, and I drove for 40 minutes and I sat outside a supermarket at 11 at night. Nothing happened for a long time. That's the part nobody tells you. I'm going to buy something ordinary, and I'm going to go home and never think about this again. The lights were on inside, but the shop was closed. You could see all the way down the aisles. And at the far end, in the freezer aisle, there was a man. He had a trolley. A stock trolley, stacked with boxes, and one of the wheels was going, and I could hear it through the glass, the steady wobbling drag. Because it was the middle of the night, and the world was very quiet. He was taking things out of the boxes and putting them into the open freezer, one at a time, and he wasn't rushing, and he wasn't slow. He was just working. He was an ordinary man. I need you to hear that. He was maybe 60, in a fleece, and he was not frightening in any way at all, and that is the single most frightening thing that has ever happened to me, because I stood in a car park and cried at the sight of a man doing his job. He didn't look up. I watched him for what felt like a long time, and he never once looked up. And I thought about walking to the door, and I thought about knocking on it, and I understood, in the way you understand things in dreams, that I must not knock on it. So I went home. Nora was asleep. I sat on the floor next to her bed until it got light, and in the morning she came downstairs and she poured her own cereal, which she just started doing, and she said, without looking at me, without any weight on it at all, she said, "He says thank you for coming." I said, "What?" And she said, "He says he's been waiting a long time." And she ate her cereal. He never came up again. Not once. Not in 2 years. I've asked her, carefully, a handful of times, and she gives me the same blank look she'd give me if I asked about the pine cones, which she also doesn't remember. Whatever it was, it's gone. And she is 9 now and completely, gloriously fine, and I have to keep telling myself that, and I do, most days. I called my mother that afternoon. I told her all of it. I told her about the trolley and the wheel and the fleece. And she was quiet for a while. And then she said, in a voice I'd never heard her use, she said, "Did he take you home?" I said, "What do you mean?" And she said, "When you were small. He'd wait. That was the whole thing, love. He'd just wait. And you'd tell me he was waiting, and I'd tell you to stop. And I made you stop, and I've never been sure since whether that was a kindness." And then she said the thing I hear at 3 a.m, most nights, still. She said, "Whoever he's waiting for, he isn't in a hurry. He's got the time. He's got all of it." I want to end this by telling you what I've decided it means, but I haven't decided. That's the honest answer. I have a theory that changes depending on how much I've slept. What I know is this: he has never come to my house. He has never spoken to me, and he has never asked me for anything. And when I stood 10 feet away from him with a pane of glass between us, he did not lift his head. He fills the freezers. He does the 11 to 7. And afterwards, he waits in the car park because he's not allowed to leave on his own, and he has been doing it since before I was born. And once, 35 years ago, a little girl told her mother about him, and her mother told her to stop, and she stopped. But she was the one he was waiting for. She's still the one he's waiting for. I check the car park sometimes. I don't mean I drive there. I mean, I check the one outside my work, and the one at the school, and the one at the shops, at the far end, where the lights don't quite reach. I'd know the wheel anywhere.